Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian, and today I would like to cover one of Zizek's most well-known ideas about cinema and philosophy, namely the idea that cinema is the ultimate pervert art. In fact, the entire Zizek quote, often cited, goes like this: "Cinema is the ultimate pervert art. It does not give you what you desire, it tells you how to desire." And what I'd like to do in this short miniature lecture is essentially give you an easy, accessible, step-by-step explanation of what Źižek exactly means. And along the way, I'm going to introduce you to the basic tenets of Slavoj Žižek's theory of cinema and how it relates to his, if you will, adaptation of the Lacanian psychoanalytic concept of the pervert. All that and more coming up in the next 20 to 30 minutes. I hope that today the live stream will have no technical issues, although you can always download the lecture on Patreon, where I will post an audio recording. In fact, I'm going to begin recording this right now by placing the mic down here. And you can also download edited transcripts courtesy of Jeneline, as well as a recurring ebook subscription on my Patreon. The latest ebook is titled, well, actually, I should say it's part of a series. So the previous one is titled the Fundamental Fantasy, which is the one that I would recommend you begin with, which is an ebook on Lacanian psychoanalysis and Zizek's theory of the fantasy. That's the one that I would recommend you begin with. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. You can find the entire Intro to Zizek ebook series, volumes 1 through 8, on my Patreon as well. There's a bunch to work through there. Okay, thank you everybody for being here with me today. Oh, by the way, the latest ebook is titled The Objective Illusion. I completely forgot. I think we're like in volume 13 now or something. So you can find all those texts on my Patreon. Thank you to everybody who is a patron and who continues to support these videos in so doing. Okay, so let's begin. As I said before, Slavoj Žižek has a well-known quote about cinema, where he says that cinema is the ultimate pervert art. It does not give you what desire, it tells you how to desire. And what I'd like to do here briefly is give you an introduction to Zizek's theory of cinema and how it relates to the Lacanian concept of perversion. And I thought I'd begin by defining some of the terms here, because perversion can be a notoriously difficult idea to fully comprehend. And so I'm going to give you some basic starting points that can hopefully help you and guide you in your understanding of this very counterintuitive idea. After all, within contemporary culture, we tend to think of the pervert as a sort of stereotypically negative and normative terms. We think of the pervert as somebody who, secretly lusts after women, etc. But nothing could be less true from a Lacanian perspective. It's a very different argument. So what I would propose, and this is how I like to explain it, is that what Zizek does by characterizing cinema as a pervert art is that he's essentially contradicting, perhaps even inverting, one of the central cliches that persist within film theory and within the popular consensus on cinema, which is that cinema is somehow inherently voyeuristic. But Zizek argues quite clearly that cinema should not be considered a voyeur's art, but instead a pervert's art. And I think it can be really helpful to juxtapose the Lacanian position apropos the voyeur in relationship to that of the pervert. So think about a voyeur for a moment. Someone who practices voyeurism is secretly looking at someone without being seen themselves. The sort of classic image of the voyeur would be somebody looking through the keyhole and looking at something taking place, like a kiss or perhaps even a couple doing it. In fact, the entire idea of the so-called peep show is that a man can enjoy a couple simulating such a romantic sexual encounter without being seen themselves. However, from a Lacanian perspective, what really takes place, and one has to be very precise here with the voyeur, is that the voyeur isn't simply enjoying seeing what is being hidden. Instead, and once again, here it serves to be very precise, the voyeur is enjoying the prohibition as such. Which is to say, what secretly sustains the desire of the voyeur isn't the sex act. Instead, what sustains his desire is precisely the notion that he is not allowed to see it, that it is the prohibition which sustains, therefore, the voyeur's desire. That's the first point. The second point that Lacan makes, apropos the voyeur, is that secretly, therefore, the voyeur's desire is not just sustained by this prohibition and the enjoyment of breaking it, but precisely by the absent, disembodied gaze of the other. Which is to say, the voyeur secretly enjoys not only the possibility of being caught, but precisely the disembodied, absent gaze of the other who is judging the voyeur, so to speak. Which is to say, the voyeur's pleasure and desire therefore has nothing to do, or at least very little to do, with the actual thing which is being seen. Instead, the voyeur derives libidinal pleasure from the prohibition as such, and from the object as gaze, the disembodied gaze, which appears to watch the voyeur in his very watching. Therefore, there is a kind of redoubled, if you will, gaze that takes place for the voyeur. The voyeur is seeing something which he is not supposed to see, and yet what sustains his pleasure is precisely that he himself is performing for the very absent, disembodied gaze, namely the gaze of the law, the gaze of prohibition. Hence, the desire that is sustained by the prohibition as such is directly related to the gaze of the disembodied, non-existent other, the big other, therefore. Hence, Lacan essentially argues that the voyeur's desire is sustained by the big other who therefore becomes the guarantor of the imaginary or real prohibition which sustains the desire of the voyeur. Now, those are a lot of complicated pieces, but I think it can actually be summarized fairly simply. The voyeur doesn't simply enjoy what he is watching. He enjoys the act of watching and being watched in his watching as such. This means that, strictly speaking, according to Slavoj Zizek, cinema isn't voyeuristic. Like, when you go into a cinema, or if you're watching TV at home, there is no big other watching you. You are watching the screen in the dark, but it's not like you're deriving pleasure from the idea that you could be caught or that you are somehow being watched by a disembodied gaze, observing your flouting of this prohibition. Instead, what cinema provides you with is, in a sense, precisely the opposite of voyeurism. It is completely allowed. It is fully endorsed for you to sit there in silence for several hours in the dark, watching other people living and doing it, as it were. Hence, Zizek's basic inversion, sorry, this is a little bit in my eye. Zizek's basic inversion, therefore, is that cinema is not a voyeur's art, that there's nothing voyeuristic about cinema, which of course is one of the cliches of film theory, that cinema essentially stages a voyeuristic male gaze who can sort of enjoy watching the female form uninterrupted and undisturbed, etc. And from a Lacanian perspective, nothing could be less true. Cinema is not voyeuristic because there is no tacit prohibition, and secondly, there is no disembodied gaze of the other, no big other that is watching you in the watching. And this is where Źižek introduces the idea that cinema is a pervert's art. If the voyeur is the one who wants to secretly watch somebody else doing it, the pervert is the one who completely identifies with the desire of the other. Which is to say, one of the fundamental aspects of perversion within Lacanian psychoanalysis is that it essentially posits that the pleasure and the desire of the subject becomes that of over-identification with the desire of the other. And think about it, when you watch a movie, you're not just vicariously enjoying what is happening on the screen, you are in a sense also learning how to desire by means of placing yourself in that situation. I think many young people will understand this, that when they had their first kiss, They weren't necessarily kissing their partner, they were kissing the person they had seen kissing on stage. In other words, it becomes a supplement and an instruction manual, if you will, for the fantasy frame, which allows us to access our own reality. We imagine that we are doing it as the character on the screen is doing it. And Zizek says that this is one of the things about all reality. It's what he calls the ontological incompleteness of reality. He says, in order to access reality, it has to be supplemented by a fantasy frame. And what cinema does is it effectively gives us a fantasy frame. And here you can see perhaps one of the distinctions between movies as such and cinema, which has nothing to do with high versus low culture. Instead, it has everything to do with the relationship of what is being presented with the fantasy frame, which is to say, to put it very programmatically, a movie, like a standard Hollywood movie, will give you an ideology, which is to say, it will give you a system of fantasy frames that can be easily applied to your own life. Cinema, on the other hand, is the process of undermining the supposed certainty of said fantasy frames, and therefore undermining your relationship to the commonsensical attitude that you may have developed towards life. In other words, cinema points out the very structural tendencies, the ideological tendencies within what we call reality as such. Whereas a regular movie will give you a prepackaged ideological lens that perfectly supplements what you already believe to be true of reality. Of course, this is a programmatic and formal distinction that has many shortcomings, but it can be a helpful way of beginning to understand what cinema is and how it relates to the idea of the pervert. So to go back to the idea of the pervert is the one who directly identifies with the desire of the other, and in so doing, makes themselves the agent of the desire of the other. And how can you be watching a movie and be the agent of the desire of the other? After all, what happens on the screen has nothing to do with you. And here Źižek argues that what cinema essentially accomplishes is that cinema points out a very central truth to all reality, which is that we never access reality directly. There always has to be some minimal distance that we have towards it. And this minimal distance is supplemented by fantasy. The example that he uses is, let's say that you're having sexual intercourse with your partner. He says, strictly speaking, you're doing it with your partner, but you're also doing it with the idea of your partner. And this idea is usually supplemented by some idea that you have of your fictional woman or man, which is presented to you through cinema or other forms of popular culture. In other words, what cinema essentially does is once again, it doesn't give you what you desire, it tells you how to desire. It informs the fantasy frame through which you access reality. In other words, your very reality becomes dependent on your identification with it, which is also supplemented by an external fantasy frame. Hence, to go back to the idea of the pervert, and I'll try to make this as simple as possible because I realize it is rather complicated. The pervert is the one who identifies fully with the desire of the other. Now, to identify fully means that you make the other the central precondition for your experience of reality, which is to say, it informs your access to reality by means of giving you the fantasy frame that sustains the supposed completeness of reality. Now, what cinema does is therefore twofold. On the one hand, cinema, in the guise of a mere movie, gives you a fantasy frame that allows you to plug this gap of the ontological incompleteness of reality with a supplementary fantasy frame. You can act as the person in the film, you can live like the person in the film, you can buy the same clothes, you can speak in the same register, etc. But on a secondary level, what cinema does is it undermines this very consistency between fantasy and reality. It serves to essentially point out the gaps and cracks within this relationship as such. And this can happen in many different genres. It can happen in comedy. One of my favorite comedies, as I mentioned before, is Peep Show. which itself, in its very title, already refers to the inherently sort of voyeuristic nature of the formal ploy of the show, which is that everything is shot through point of view. We are essentially in the characters' heads, quite literally. It eliminates the minimal distance that we come to associate with cinema, therefore not allowing us the tacit identification with the character through this distance, but forces us to be in their heads as such. And there's a great scene in Peep Show, which I've mentioned before, where one of the characters, a relatively insecure and somewhat weak man titled Mark, is told by his friend that the solution is to look in the mirror in the morning and say to yourself, I'm the man. I'm the man. And you repeat this mantra until you believe that you are the man. In other words, you create a liminal distance towards yourself. You supplement it with the fantasy frame of masculinity, and you can go out into the world and be confident. However, the show beautifully inverts this, because when Mark looks into the mirror, he makes one crucial mistake. He doesn't say, I'm the man. He says, I'm a man. And in this positing, I am a man, and the substitution of the with a, he essentially stages the properly, if you will, impotent core or truth of this very masculine ritual. To state I am a man is completely different from I am the man. To be the man is to posit yourself as the primordial male, the male who dominates over others. To posit yourself as a man is actually retroactively a seemingly feminine gesture to insist on his being man in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, as it were. Here we have, to my mind, a very beautiful, actually cinematic way of undermining the very gaze and the very idea of the supplemental frame within cinema, which is to say, movies tried to provide us with a fantasy frame, you are the man. What cinema accomplishes is an inversion of this that problematizes it, that makes it like a bone stuck in your throat. And this is precisely why cinema is symptomatic. And I'll explain it in the next lecture. Cinema doesn't point towards the easy integration of fantasy and reality, but precisely towards its incongruencies, towards the ways in which it doesn't match, in which it doesn't fit. Cinema is one of the ways in which we can stage this very gap between reality and fantasy. And perhaps that's why Zizek argues that cinema is the ultimate pervert art. And now I'll explain the second part of the quote, because then it'll click. So the second part of the quote, I'll repeat the whole quote, is, cinema is the ultimate pervert art. It does not give you what you desire, it tells you how to desire. Now, we've already covered the ideological aspects of this, which is that cinema essentially gives you a fantasy frame through which you can access reality, thereby inhabiting a certain version of reality. But secondly, there's also a psychoanalytic Lacanian point to be made about this. One of the central tenets of psychoanalysis, which Źižek has repeated over and over again, is that psychoanalysis teaches us that not only do we not always get what we want, but strictly speaking, we don't really know what it is that we want. Oscar Wilde has a great quip about this, right? Where he says that life has only two tragedies. Either you get exactly what you want, or, either you don't get what you want, or you get exactly what you want. From a Lacanian perspective, of course, to acquire the thing, the first place, namely the aspect of not having it, the loss, therefore to have it, to have acquired it, is to have symbolically lost it. However, Lacan essentially argues that this is true as a structuring principle for all desire. And the basic mechanism works like this. Lacan's assumption is that we only access reality through fantasy. That fantasy supplements a certain gap in reality, and that the subject provides this fantasy frame, hence inhabiting reality. However, the problem for Lacan is that, therefore, this fantasy frame is structured around an object of desire, which is to say, for Lacan, fantasy is always structured by desire as such. And here we always have to ask the question, well, what desire and whose desire? Which is to say, what is it that we really want, and why is it that we want it? Now, what a lot of commercial and popular culture gives you is a prepackaged version of what to want. We identify as a consumer, as someone who practices a certain lifestyle, as someone who is successful and happy, because we do so based on how we have seen other people be happy and successful in life. We essentially try to mimic them. We try to aspire towards a certain type of happiness which we have seen in others, or at least which is being presented to us as aspirational through various commercial activities. For example, you watch an advertisement about a car and you see a happy family and you think, well, if I have this car, I will have a happy family, etc. But of course, it's not so simple. It runs much deeper than that. None of us truly believe that buying a car will make our life necessarily be like in the advertisements. It's that in order to exist, we have to adopt a certain fantasy frame. In fact, one of the easiest ways to go to pieces is when your fantasy frame suddenly is undermined. When the seeming security of your fantasy frame, in which everything is exactly how it should be, and you're doing everything for the right reasons, and you've quantified every single optimized metric of your life, when this is undermined, that is the most dangerous thing. When you suddenly encounter somebody who has a completely different way of viewing the world, who suddenly undermines the seeming security of how you've structured your reality, someone who takes away or undermines your fantasy frame. And so we're very happy when we're fully plugged in to a seamlessly integrated fantasy frame that seems to fit our reality. The sort of mechanized life of modern suburban living in which DoorDash delivers to you toilet paper as soon as you run out, etc. This kind of seamlessly integrated life appears frictionless. Of course, there's always a certain return of the repressed. There's always some element of disaster or horror lurking underneath this very idyll, which, for example, is one of the central themes of Jaws. The monster which emerges from the depths at the beachfront, etc. The return of the repressed, if you will. But against this, what cinema essentially accomplishes is that cinema confronts us with the very construction of this reality through a fantasy frame, which say cinema is precisely not seamlessly integrated. It doesn't give us what we want, what we desire. It points out that there's a certain deficiency, a certain problem or gap within the very structure of desire as such, which in so doing suggests that there is an insufficiency, a gap, a necessary one, a fruitful one within reality as such. Now, this is all admittedly still very abstract, and you may wonder at this point, well, what does this have to do with Slavoj Žižek's theory of cinema? So I'd like to conclude, and if you've stayed with me, thank you very much. I'd like to conclude by giving you some of the basic and most important points of Zizek's theory of cinema, why it's so important to him. And hopefully that can then sort of tie it all up. So Slavoj Žižek himself, perhaps I should have begun the lecture with this, it's certainly the most accessible part. Slavoj Žižek himself said that he originally wanted to be a film director. That was his dream. And he sort of ventures a generalizing theory about this. He says he thinks that most people who become artists or writers or philosophers, etc., they always wanted to do something else and they failed. And so they take everything that is in that failure and they put it into their other endeavor. And so Zizek says that if you wanted to easily psychoanalyze him, you would basically say that he is a failed film director who therefore places cinema at the heart of all of his theoretical and philosophical writing. However, there's one really important thing to note here that I think is sometimes missed, which is that Zizek is not a film critic in the traditional sense. He doesn't write that much on cinema directly. What I mean by that is that he doesn't use philosophy and theory to illustrate cinema. Instead, what he does is the other way around. He uses cinema to illustrate philosophical and theoretical concepts. This means that cinema runs throughout his work, and yet he's very rarely writing directly about film. Essentially what he does is that he looks at movies and draws out theoretical and philosophical conceptual implications from what is seen on screen. In fact, he says often he doesn't watch the entire movie at all. He just watches a little bit of it, and this sparks an idea, and then he uses that to illustrate his theory. His ultimate goal here isn't just to write about film, but to find ways and avenues into making theory and philosophy more accessible. This is something he's talked about many times. And secondly, or perhaps finally, Zizek's take on cinema, therefore, is radically, runs radically counter to the idea of high art and low art. Cinema, Slavoj Žižek very rarely talks about the difference between cinemas and movies. It's essentially a formal distinction that perhaps serves no more purpose in the age of postmodern entertainment. Instead, Zizek argues that sometimes we can find the most important philosophical messages precisely in seemingly vapid entertainment. Some of Zizek's most important contributions to cinema and philosophy have come, for example, from such films as Kung Fu Panda, which is a wonderful film, by the way, I should add. And so what Zizek does, and I think this is important, is that he writes about movies that other philosophers might not necessarily take seriously. And in so doing, I think he's able to create a lot of transitions between popular culture and philosophy and vice versa. However, this love of cinema for Zizek all boils down to one central figure, which is Hitchcock. Hitchcock is Zizek's enduring cinematic role model, idol, and obsession. And whilst he makes references to other figures like Orson Welles, etc., the specific relationship between films such as Vertigo and Lacanian psychoanalysis is the recurring motif of Slavoj Zizek's arguments about film. The ones that you might encounter most directly are related to cinema and ideology. One of Zizek's critiques of ideology, or one of his contributions to philosophy, is to bring the critique of ideology back into the spotlight. The critique of ideology was considered for a long time by many leftists in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s as being an outmoded Marxist way of talking about culture that was very interesting. Zizek brought this idea of Ideologiekritik back into the forefront of his psychoanalytic and leftist writing. And cinema was one of the ways in which he does so. And so the critique of ideology for Zizek is always directly related to the critique of cinema. His basic position is that cinema is that which gives us fantasy frames by which to access reality. And ideology is the process by which a certain reality is constructed through fantasy frames. Now, perhaps I could have started this video with that, but I thought it'd be fun to sort of jump right in with the voyeur and the pervert. So those are some of the central aspects about Zizek, some of the central aspects of Zizek's critique of cinema and the way in which it informs his work. What I would propose is that in the next couple of weeks, we spend a little bit more time talking about cinema, fleshing out these ideas. I will also be making some videos in relationship to cinema, but my basic idea would be that this lecture series, which we're effectively beginning today, will be a lecture series entirely dedicated to talking about cinema and Slavoj Zizek's theory of cinema and how it relates to the critique of ideology and Lacanian psychoanalysis. And it's funny because I've been hosting these lectures now for I don't know, about 4 years, and whilst we've occasionally spoken about Zizek's take on cinema, we really never have confronted it directly. And so that would be my proposal here, would be to say, let's talk about Zizek and cinema. So yeah, if you'd like to join me for that ride, you are welcome to either watch these videos or become a patron. On Patreon, you can download the audio recordings of these lectures, the transcripts, and the accompanying ebooks. The latest ebook is titled The Objective Illusion. The one before that was The Fundamental Fantasy. And you can also download the complete guide to Zizek ebook series, which is all part of the same package. Basically, you sign up once and you can download all the ebooks and sort of catch up with where we are. Thank you so much. I am going to be hosting a patron-only Discord live seminar in about 5 minutes, which I will also post as an audio file to Patreon. So for those of you who are patrons already, thank you so much. I will see you in mere minutes. And to everybody joining me today live, thank you so much for being here and being part of this community. I really do hope that the internet was a bit better today. Greetings to New Zealand. I see a comment from New Zealand. I will see you guys very soon.